planned now for half an hour discussion for basically based on the two talks. But there might be some questions specifically meant for your presentation, and I think the start is that. Okay. So questions to Mark at this stage. I have one actually. You're identifying multiple services or hotspots, as you mentioned. Can you explain that a bit, because it was a bit out of my focus there. Right?
Okay. Well, referring back to the Tamar map there, my colleagues in the West Country River Trust looked at digital terrain maps, land use, biodiversity, a whole raft of different data sets, including soils, and inferred from that that certain habitats are particularly rich in biodiversity, are naturally within floodplain, able to absorb flood peaks naturally, good for sequestering carbon because of the kind of soil and slope that's there, nutrient cycling because proximity to watercourses and so forth. Recreation, absolutely. Yeah, and they've got kind of overlays, not of the data, and then of the inferences of the services, and then began to overlay them to say, well, these places, for example, to the right there, is known as a culm grasslands. It's relatively unproductive grasslands from a purely economic point of view, but it holds a lot of water, does a lot for water storage, so good for water resource, good for water quality, good for flood defence, good for biodiversity, good for the regional tourist economy because it's a characteristic landscape, and so it goes on and on and on. And yet the subsidies still apply to drain that land so that you can increase cattle production. So the farmer is profiting from a few more cattle, but society is losing in terms of the quantity, quality, propensity to flood of water, of the loss of biodiversity, of implications for regional ecotourism and so forth. So you can begin to play tunes with those if you stack up your data and make inferences about their relationships.
I think there's maybe also in that sometimes we think of hotspots as problem areas.
Oh, okay, yes.
And you're in this context, you were meaning an area like, ooh, there's a lot going on.
Honeypot sites, how about that?
Yeah, I mean,
that's very kind of American, isn't it?
It could be a problem if it's not taken care of. I mean, if those services aren't valued, like the example we just gave. But I think hotspots in this case is meant to be lots of services being provided.
Lots of services. So another one would be where maize growing is happening on a floodplain, which actually is really good for floodwater detention, nutrient cycling, biodiversity, angling, and the maize production gets a profit, but it just trashes everything else,
So what you suggested, then you would ask the farmers to pay them for natural protection in their earlier maize fields and get subsidies from the EU, or how would you then tackle this? It's a good idea, seen from the natural point of view, but if I'm a farmer, I say now they get completely crazy. And tell me what I have to do on my own land.
Yes.
So the question is, how can you link this to policies, or how will you do it?
Well, I mean, I've been in Europe talking at that level, but we can't rely on top-downism because that's so damn slow. Essentially, through the Rivers Trust movement, we tackle it in three different ways, which is polluter pays. In other words, if there's legislation, you make sure that the bad cops go in there and say, look, just get your act together, sort out your slurry leakages into the river or whatever, if there's legislation. If there's not, and we want to go beyond it, then there are two tools. One is to talk to the farmers and say, do you know how much this is costing you? Losing this land, losing the nutrients that you have to compensate. So there's a win-win internally for the farmer. So farm advice is a big strand. And the third one is beneficiary pays, and Leon's mentioned this in terms of payment for ecosystem services. The water company here, Southwest Water, has agreed with government to route money to farmers to do things that are over and above what's required as a statutory minimum. vectored via the River Trust as a trusted intermediary. And they go onto a farm and they sort of say, well, this particular land use in this place, this stewardship of chemicals, this other stuff is causing damage. And the government has agreed with the water company's estimate that will have a 65-to-1 benefit to cost ratio in terms of controlling customer bills. So the customers are paying £5 extra on their bills, but that saves them having to pay in future for a new treatment works with all the energy and chemicals and waste arising that happens. So it needs to link to the policy environment, the economic environment, the way water companies work and so forth. There's a big joining up across sectors of society. It's not easy, but then we've got a messed up society. So you've got to tackle the system. With the politicians at the top, they're kind of messed up as well, aren't they? But
Leon, do you want to comment on that? Based on your...
Yeah, there's one thing that's come out, it's still hidden in many of the debates, is that when you do the evaluation in one of these decision analysis situations on individual services, people tend to sort of maximize the benefits or minimize the cost. And that works out wrong because most of these ecosystem service bundles have trade-offs internally. So also the valuation is complex and you don't get the maximum of each of the benefits for each of the services. But if you do it right, then it will show you which policy will, as a sum, benefit is the smartest, and again, over time and over space. Another thing is that if you look at this example, you will need your supervisory body or your regional government to make sure that there are these services which go beyond individual benefits and are collective or public benefits, which nobody will put on the table individually. And it doesn't necessarily have to increase taxes or so, because in many cases we are already paying for it in some form of tax.
yes,
People don't realize it, but we do already pay for a lot of the ecosystem services. One example in Holland, very actually, our drinking water. Much of our drinking water comes from groundwater pumped up. And we have an organization which sort of supervises all the different companies. And there's a complaint that from 2 years ago, so that they had to charge to the consumers extra money because they were draining money or pumping money from water from natural areas. And these nature reserve managers were collecting money from the drinking water companies. Well, this is a perfect example. It's great. People want to pay for good, clean drinking water. So show it, make it visible. But you need bodies, institutional bodies that take that position and say, okay, this is a collective public good, so this is how we arrange it. We're not doing it through the market.
But I think it's a difference between the water and the soils. The water it's a public thing. The river Rhine and the groundwater is public. You just came back from a farmer's interviews last weekend, yeah? And these farmers were in the Netherlands and they were really fed up, but they are always, they told me, because of this I just want to give this into the discussion.
Yeah, I'll
It's
come
my
down
land.
this topic is better for you next.
Yeah, yes, but I say it's my land, I own my land,
I have a right
this
to-
for the farmers. So how will somebody, my father's owned it, my grandfather's owned it, I make the production in Europe for food.
yes.
How do people come and tell me, oh, you better use this land for another thing? And this ownership of the land and the perception, we all in Europe have 5% farmers. The rest is just like we. Not a farmer. yeah, that means
I would hope so.
if you go but they produce our food and they have a very large impact into the ecosystem services soil. So if I go and make maps of soil where they could be used for, and where's the potential, and then I go, but then I come to the farmers which is their land, and I try to tell them this is a very, very big challenge.
Mm.
And there is another thing. If we, for example, think, oh, green grassland is fantastic because it stores organic matter. Yes, it's true. But then we feed cows with this grassland, and the cows are the main, or the animal production is the main, as a main impact in climate change, because they produce such a lot of climatic greenhouse gases. So where to start there? Because the world is owned by people.
Yeah, I mean, from a river trust point of view, it's interesting. The river trusts in the UK have filled this democratic niche, because if we go in to see a farmer, then the dialogue is, how can we make you more profitable? They trust us because we're looking for the win-wins. When the regulators go on, the regulators have produced a system in the UK called catchment-sensitive farming. So the guy from the Environment Agency who prosecuted the farmer last week then drives up the next week and says, well, I'm here to help you this week. And does this translate to all European languages? Because, you know, that's kind of what the farmers think. So some things don't work from a stick point of view, but developing that relationship. Now, why has water been such a successful medium for PES schemes around the world? And it's quite simply that water companies now have to have, in the UK, have 30-year plans, and farmers want to hand the land over to their children. So they both got a long-term interest, and certainly all the farmers I know don't want to trash their land. So then you've got to intervene with the retail, the food manufacturers and retailers that are forcing down the farm gate prices, and find other ways to compensate around that. For example, by the rerouting of CAP towards production of more services like water, like carbon, like nutrients, so that the incentives actually make it possible, often for the farmers to do what they'd like to do anyway if the market didn't force them to such low prices.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the CAP, of course, they've chosen this route to stimulate particular good practices, and because there is no way that the Commission can stop individuals to do with the soil what they want to do, except they can tax certain kinds of behavior or penalize certain kinds of behavior, like high emissions or wrong types of products or bad quality of groundwater, which is not their own, and because they run through their system. So that's always what the regulatory process has been, to look at the outputs and then try to get to the process. On the other side, the farmers should indeed also go to this slow thinking, long-term view. So, well, maximum profits over time will require me to look around what type of mix of services is more beneficial in the context of my community rather than my individual benefit. In the short run, he will always maximize his individual benefit. In the long run, if he's the only one left doing the wrong thing, then it becomes another. So these are very complex social processes and making choices in one generation which affects the future generations as well. That's, I mean, ecosystem services will not solve this. It will make it explicit, because the concept requires you to think spatially and temporally at larger and multiple scales, and bring all the beneficiaries and stakeholders at the table when decisions are made. This is why current politicians, all trained in the neoclassical traditions, hate it. They're forced to expand their decision room of thinking. They were trained to make very simple cost benefits, and all the complex costs and complex benefits were thrown at PM. So they have neatly tabulated the costs and benefits went through the market, and their planning agency would give them all the numbers. We have a better cost-benefit ratio for this alternative, so we'll do it. Then 10 years down the road, most of these big infrastructure projects in the Netherlands, but all across Europe, run out of positive benefits because they didn't include most of the relevant processes. So it's always, I mean, back to my training in Odom's time, when system thinking in the 60s was just expanding like crazy, and everybody said, what does this mean? Well, what it definitely means is always solve your problem with solutions which have a higher spatial and temporal level, because you cannot solve it efficiently and effectively, sustainably at the level where the problem is identified. This brings me back to your farm at the local level. Individual farm, you cannot solve the long-term challenge. And one thing, the food problem of the world by agroeconomists is always sort of downgraded to, a little more technology, fertilizer, and we'll solve it. 9 billion people, no problem. But they never bring in the calculations how much other services have to go, because we have to convert all possible area into food grown area.
Yeah, and that's not.
Yeah. I'm considering the issue of perhaps how to value unknown ecosystem services, or put it, if I could elaborate a bit on this, because maybe I think the ecosystem service concept is useful. We can speak about things, that these ecosystem services, but at the end of the day, we are putting ourselves as God, actually, because we are harvesting the ecosystem. We should be part of the ecosystem. I could put an example. For subsoil compaction, which seems to be nearly permanent, you could meet people saying, okay, we need to have some ecosystem services still okay. Production should be okay. Yield reduction to some degree would be okay. But the water should be able to get away. There should be some aeration that should be okay also for the subsoil. So now we have investigated the ecosystem services for the soil with respect to compaction, and everybody is happy. Then I'm asking, did we look up, did we think of all ecosystem services? I mean, if we compact the soil, probably there are some processes that we will perhaps in 50 years discover, oh, there was some side effect. So when will we arrive at the need to take into the precautionary principle? Do you have any opinions on this?
There's a whole load of questions actually in that. Now, there was an approach published by DEFRA, Department for Environment, Food and Rural
Affairs that my colleagues call Department for Environment, Eradication of Food and Rural Areas. But it proposed a 3-stage valuation where actually the first level is where a group of people, ideally stakeholders, but if not, then people with different backgrounds, get together and they look at the system first and they say, does this change, compaction or opening up the structure, does it have a double plus, very strong benefit for this service, a plus, a 0, a minus or a 2 minus, or a big question mark, like, don't know. The important thing is it allows us to think of the system first. The first thing we do is think of the system. In terms of then putting values on, well, actually, for some decision making, that's enough. And some of our coastal defence schemes have been based on stakeholder evaluation where, well, yes, this scheme in Poole in Dorset, for example, will be optimally beneficial because we've thought of the multiple benefits. For other schemes, then you need to go into the top level, which is bespoke valuation for everything. But mainly you're in the middle tier of what's called value transfer, where you transfer from studies that have already been done. Then you've got your gaps. And when I worked for the Environment Agency in the UK, before they pensioned me off, which was great, I did more economic studies than the economics team, and the economics team still have done, because they're in the neoclassical mold, and they're going, well, we don't have methods to do that, whereas I don't care as a non-economist, so I'm interested in travel cost methods. What's the spiritual value of the view of the Rhine, is it the nearest river? Yeah. Well, how many people go there and how far have they travelled? And let's add it up. It's not the value of the Rhine, but it's an indication of how much people value it. So you begin to get constituency value. Absolutely. I'm not a big fan of willingness to pay because it rarely translates into reality. But there are flaky assumptions and methods that non-economists like me are very happy to state as an assumption to bring in values. The important thing to say about valuation, I've emphasized it a few times, is that valuation is not accountancy. It's not decision making, it's decision support. And the analogy I always make is when the M5, one of the motorway in the UK, was being widened, they used £168,000 as the value of a human life. Okay, so like if so many people don't die on a widened motorway, then the cost benefit is, and then we'll pour the concrete and kill all the biodiversity and all the rest of it, you know, the things we do. Doesn't mean if you had £169,000, you could buy my daughter. But she is a teenager, so, you know, we kind of into the negotiating period now. But the point is, economics is just a normalizer. You're trying to bring it into the kind of common language that politicians get. You're saying, is it big, is it small, is it negative, is it positive? How does it compare to the food? How does it compare to the, you know, the honeypot visitor site, whatever, where we've got harder economic values. But it's to normalise as many of these things as possible for weighting in decisions.
Right. Yeah, very, very much. I mean, this is the difference between valuation and commodification.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? You put a value on a service or a natural capital, but it doesn't mean that you can buy it. It hasn't become commodified. It's not on the shelf of your supermarket. But it has to be valued in order to make useful decisions and efficient and sustainable decisions, justified. So, but back to, we cannot exclude that we will develop new uses for ecosystems that we have not developed yet. So then this new use will determine what that new service will be. And whether all systems can do it or only particular systems, and how to manage your systems for that type of service. I mean, that's science. We have to keep on discovering and developing. But what we can do is indeed, as Mark said, be systematic. If you prepare for a decision on changing land use, to include as much as you can grasp. And we can grasp more than most of the politicians, given their level of education. And we'll see next Thursday again what the range in Europe will be. But I mean, that's our challenge. We are scientists and we have been invested in by society to do smart thinking. And so we have to feed back this not always welcome information to politicians. So, well, you paid me to say these bad things to you. So I do. But it's definitely the challenge in each of these processes to be as complete as possible, time, space-wise, multiple uses, multiple stakeholders, all these multiples. And they hate it. I'm telling you, they hate the word multiple. Wait, Adriana? Your mind on Mark?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest imponderables in economics, and I used to do a bit of economics once upon a time on the UK Treasury model. I don't know how good it was because you know what's happened to Britain over many years, but one of the biggest imponderables is human behaviour, in interpreting what humans do. And this is the thing that often throws economics into disarray. Are people going to save or spend, for example? What are the thresholds in various behaviour patterns for various groups of society, etc., etc.? It's a very complicated bit of economics that isn't easy and interpretable in its compartmentalised way you describe the cost-benefit analysis. To then put on top of that this whole complexity of ecosystem services that we don't really understand yet as scientists in many cases, and we've had pointed out the complexity and contradiction of some of those ecosystem services regarding greenhouse gas emission, grasslands and carbon storage, and without really having that properly quantified, it becomes very difficult. I find myself defending economists, which is not my intent. It becomes very difficult to bring all that into a workable model for economists, doesn't it? I mean, I think we need to move down this route, but we need to bear in mind that the complexities for conventional economic thinking will bring this sort of level of extra layered, multiple complexity and ambiguity about much of the science we're doing, which is not defined as clearly as we might like, is a difficult task for them to take on.
Yeah. Well, it's a question of whether we're trying to fit this into economic models or trying to evolve economic models to fit the real world. And, you know, accommodating uncertainty.
That's really groundbreaking stuff for the policymakers. But hey, we're never going to have perfect knowledge. But we know that the world is a lot more complicated. So we need the porosity in the decision making, and to bring the uncertainties into the economics, rather than to kind of say, well, we know how much a pig's worth, so we grow loads of pigs there, then we've got a good cost benefit, and forget the rest because we can't put a pound or a euro or a dollar sign on it, which is the kind of world we're in at the moment. We've got this spurious sense of uncertainty. Whenever I'm challenged at a conference about my flaky economics, when I always say it's flaky, well, how does that fit with a really hard economics, us economists? I go, well, who is it that crashed the global economic system, me or you? So what we think of as certainty hides a lot of uncertainty, and what we think of uncertainty, we're actually probably a lot more certain about. We're certain that it's uncertain, if you get me. I feel like Donald Rumsfeld now, I shut up.
Yeah, I mean, when knowledge is not sufficient, then the precautionary principle comes in. We know that we don't have every bit and detail yet in order. Then be careful. I mean, there's a lot at stake, and this idea of uncertainty analysis is only to give you a grasp of where you can make decisions informed and where you should be very careful and maybe step back a little longer. It doesn't tell you to take the risk like playing the stock exchange. It doesn't work that way. And another thing that in that ballpark, yes, I tend to think that we have a lot of knowledge. What is the problem is that we have a tradition of 2 centuries of breaking science into very small compartments. And as Mark gave an example, nobody talks to each other anymore because we speak different languages after so many years. But in fact, we're still talking about the same complex reality. And we have different angles at it. So step 1 is talk to each other, try to speak each other's language. And that's where system science tried to make a big breakthrough. And economics and ecology have sort of, spearheaded this debate around this concept, because the world is at stake. The next generation is knocking on the door and saying, well, you baby boomers, you're really fucked up. And we're now just realizing it. I mean, that generation, ESP, I mentioned this ecosystem partnership. We had a wonderful meeting in Bali last summer with 500 people from all over the world, mostly from that part of the world. And more than 3/4 were younger than 30. And they're all there saying, what are we going to do about this? And no talk about, well, it's all uncertain. They blow them away. So we know this, and we know that we can solve and do better. And we will not solve for eternity, but we will definitely do better.
Well, I think the ecosystem of services approach is one that kind of has to happen now with the situation our society has put itself in. We've moved away from where just about every other society on the planet was, and some still are, where ecosystems are a fundamental and innate part of their lives and the quality of their everyday existence. And we've detached ourselves from this, and we're now trying to bring it back in this sort of slightly formalised, stilted structure within an economic way of thinking. What we really need to do, and I know we can't do this, but what isn't an end point, is that we need to be saying to the economists, here's the ecosystem, and your economy sits within that, not the other way around.
Yeah.
That's why I use my nested version of the cascade model that's more commonly used, because
we're a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, and the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of us, and yet we kind of think, we're bigger than that. If if I had a magic wand, which I haven't got, by the way, World Trade Organization, profits foregone, constrains so much of how we can spend our money, including CAP, Common Agricultural Policy. Think that through. That's called feudalism. If you own it, then you can make a profit doing whatever the hell you want. If your interests are affected by that, you've got to pay me not to make a profit by ruining the world for everyone. So that's cemented exactly that developed worldview that you're talking about. So that's if I could change one thing in this world, well, there's a few things actually. That one do for starters. The World Trade Organization profit foregone rule, because that assumes, it's interesting, I kind of wrote a whole book about this actually, but at the beginning of the 20th century, we had a saying, Englishman's home is his castle. Male, always male, of course. It meant that property conferred almost absolute rights. And yet, by the turn of this millennium, we've got nature conservation legislation, catchment policies, subsidies, common law. Think that through. That's the services the landscape produce from which everyone benefits. So already the policy environment has moved over a century quite dramatically in hard legislation, subsidy, common law, public understanding, towards looking not at property but the services beneficial to people. So we've got to encourage that transition. And there are certain things standing in the way of it, and World Trade Organization rules are one.
To extend on this, I'm just curious about this mapping exercise. How can you actually look at the value of ecosystem services? And it strikes me as the current system is kind of cherry picking certain services. Isn't the risk in this that you are going to cherry pick certain high potential zones, so that because they become more valuable for society, many different actions. And then, ultimately, if you take this example of a river trust, if you think about water quality, you'd be more concerned about certain areas, so you'd be willing to pay a higher price for better management there. But ultimately, if you really go down this route, you need to kind of pay people for different services they provide with their land. So, for example, a farmer halfway slope could also have a purification function for a higher farmer that continues to
Yes, absolutely.
And the number of transaction payments required would be without end.
That's true. So basically the CAP is already an instrument that you could further develop to solve these problems, because we're in this one ecosystem with different property owning farmers who affect each other. There's a lot of legislation in natural resources and environment in the US that came from upstream, downstream debates. And it was basically solved by saying, well, you are not to pollute upstream this river. And yes, if that requires a big investment because your practice has always been so, you may be able to subsidize that initial, but your behavior has to change. And you cannot resort to this medieval or feudal system anymore. On the cherry picking and the mapping, I think this is exactly where the European Commission is now very strict, aiming towards. It's not that they don't like the word standardized because they get a lot of flack, but harmonized methodology to map and assess and evaluate. And it's going to take until 2022 at least, make sure that everybody understands what we're trying to do. And maybe in some parts of you will actually do it and implement it. But it is exactly to avoid the very creative individual that is going to cherry pick. And businesses are jumping up to make sure that they will benefit from this lack of harmonized legislation. So the aim is to develop a method for all member states to map in a similar fashion, to create value mapping which is at different levels consistent, locally and nationally and European. because the markets are crossing and the flows are crossing the borders. So that's a huge challenge. If we don't do it, that's the flip side, because it is incredibly complex. They don't like to be faced and to realize that what they're up against. But if we don't do it, you might just as well commit suicide. I mean, there's no alternative.
So the complexity doesn't go away by doing
No,
it.
exactly. This is my last anecdote. It's so beautiful. We have a central planning bureau in the Netherlands dating from the 1930s, when they all thought, the economists thought that they could plan the economy. And the Netherlands still has the agency, although we never had this communist regime to implement a bureaucratic and plan the economy. But so it's our economic planning agency. It's stacked to the roof with neoclassical economists. Nobody else gets in. So what they basically do is maintain this growth paradigm by advising the government how to invest, how to manipulate interest rates, and it's all based on a very simple economic model, neoclassical model. There's a few people in there that we talk to, try to kick them awake and so. The nicer ones will discuss with us, and they will actually acknowledge, whisper, that their models are incomplete, only take part of the reality, but the rest is so hard to model. It's either because the complexity of the ecosystem or the complexity of human behavior. So they stick to what they can model, which is so-called predictive consumer behavior and price management. And that's what they do, and they keep advising our government to do according to their models. And even the political parties from left to right run this model with their party programs to show that their party programs are more beneficial for their electorate. So this one guy retired 2 years ago, and when he retired, he wrote a paper where he basically explicitly said, we're only cutting about 1/9 of the Dutch economy in our models. And we're basing our policy advice on 1/9 of the reality. But we have no way how to include the other 8/9 because we're not trained to do it. And so with this in mind, I will just teach students as much as possible. Learn a natural science approach in a methodological and philosophical, and learn social sciences.
Yes.
If you don't do both, you'll never end up in the right.
I've drawn a distinction between economics and economics and value. Is quite a quick one. I've drawn a distinction between economics
and value, oh, sorry, accountancy and value a number of times. Another one is actually between complexity and difficult. Because people assume that if they use the word complexity, they're actually talking about complexity. Actually, we know about the complexity, so just get on with it. Get on with the difficult bit. We know enough, get on with it. So I told you it'd be quick, didn't I?
Now she forgot the question.
I like your approach. I just say, in the comparison with water, water is so easy to measure. Yeah? You have to dilute it in or not.
Yes.
Yeah? Do you have it
well,
clean
we're
or
aquatic
not?
scientists, so
No.
we're
Established monitoring programs for water. If we come back from your approach to the European reality, yeah, and we ask each of us here in the room, who is soil scientist, how would you then classify an ecosystem service of our different soils? I think we will hear from you more in the afternoon on this, yeah? We even, in one room, we will get soils maybe from 1, on the scale from 1 to 10, we will get numbers from 3 to 7, yeah? That means, what I would like as well to know and discuss with you is, if we are already, in the moment, ready to define ecosystem functions and services and provide maps for Europe, which do not have an uncertainty of 90%. Yeah? And this is just a question to the auditory, for maybe after lunch or so.
Yeah.
But
Well, one remark, and I showed her diagram, what's happening now in soil science corner of ecosystem services, or vice versa, the ecosystem services corner of soil science, is that, I mean, it's a very young field. Ecosystem services is much older than they claim to be. But this corner is rapidly expanding. Robinson and Estelle are doing incredible work on this now. Get together, make a working group on ecosystem services of soil science and focus on it. What are the possibilities? Where are the challenges? Where is the knowledge already available but not being applied? And there's a bunch of papers now coming out, and just recently, since 2010, just pop, ecosystem services and soils. Just Google it and bang! And it goes really quick. But there's a lot to be done. And if you're going to advise the European Commission through this project, this is the window of opportunity. You know that there's not going to be a soil directive because of political reasons, but this might be the roundabout way to get some soil science in politics at European level. But you have this is the way.